Hello, Brit. Today we're going to talk about Jane Eyre chapters 14 and 15. So if you're keeping up with the schedule, which I definitely hope that you are, you should be listening to this recording on Thursday, March 26th. So only today and tomorrow, and then we can take a break. I know we're all ready for it, even though we can't go anywhere over spring break, but at least we won't have to work all day. So these chapters were pretty confusing. So if you found them that way, then that's okay. And there's a reason for that. There's a lot of things that Mr. Rochester is saying to Jane that he's being extremely vague. And he's doing that on purpose. It's all foreshadowing, but you won't know that until you've read the whole book. Like, I, of course, have read the book multiple times, so I know exactly what he's referring to. But he's being very obtuse, and he's keeping Jane in the dark about a lot of stuff. And so she's confused, and therefore we as the reader are also kind of confused. Okay, so if you found these two chapters confusing, that's okay. The rest of it's not like that, but there is a reason, okay? So she mentions how she didn't see much of Mr. Rochester as we get started with the chapter. He was busy going a lot to visit the people in the neighboring area and all of that, and he didn't even send for Adele very much. She would occasionally pass him in the hallway, but that was about it. Like, you know, sometimes he would greet her, and other times he would just walk past. So she didn't really worry about it. But then one day he had some people for dinner, and after he left, he rang the bell for Adele and Jane to go downstairs. So they went downstairs, and Adele immediately sees a package and is super excited because she realizes that it's her present. And so Mr. Rochester sends her to a corner to open it and says, you know, don't bother me with what's in it. I don't want to see you exclaim over everything. Just go sit over there quietly and look through it. He says, let your operation be conducted in silence. And then the French after that, he says, keep still, child. Do you understand? So she goes over there and is just exclaiming like, oh, it's so beautiful, as she's taking stuff out of the box. And so he calls for Jane to come over and talk to him. So it's kind of a little fireside chat between he and Jane, and he asks her to pull the chair up where he can see her more. And so then he calls Miss Fairfax down so that she can go over and sit with Adele, and Adele can show her all of the pretty things that she's gotten in her present. And so then he starts talking with Jane, and she, at first he's not really saying anything though, he's just looking at the fire, and so she's sort of studying him. And this ties back in with what we talked about yesterday with the study of physiognomy, where they really thought that somebody's facial features could tell you a lot about their character. And so she's sort of looking at his features a little more closely and seeing that. And so he finally turns and looks at her and says, you examined me, Miss Eyre. Do you think me handsome? And before she even thinks, she just answers honestly. And she says, no, sir. And he kind of laughs at that and is like, okay, well, that's different. Because normally somebody would try to flatter somebody. This was an age of flattery. Like, they were always flattering people and all that. And she says, I beg your pardon. I should have replied, it's not easy to give an answer about appearances. And he's like, no, you shouldn't have said that indeed. So he says, what faults do you find in me? Like, basically, like, why do you find me ugly or whatever? And she's like, please, just forget I said that. And he's like, no, tell me, criticize. Is it my forehead? You know, what is it? And so he goes through and just kind of is making fun of her as they're, because of her answering so honestly. But we find out later, you know, in the end of chapter 15, that he actually really appreciated that response. So we'll talk about that when we get there. And so then he goes into this long puzzling thing about how he's so much older than she is, and you know what that means, and how you know, she is so young and innocent, and he used to be good, but now he's not. And again, all of that is like really confusing. She's like, what is he talking about? Because he is not coming out and, you know, being very plain about what he means. And he's doing that for a reason. She does go on to say that some people probably would have thought him ugly, but looking at him, she didn't really think so. And so what I want to just emphasize again there is that it very much was the case that in this time period, in the Victorian era, there was a very, very narrow vision of what beauty was, okay? Like, for a male, you had to be tall, very slim, with broad shoulders, tapering down to a narrow waist, blonde hair, blue eyes, period. Like, if you didn't fall into those features, you weren't considered attractive. And that's odd to us because we have so many different, ideas about what beauty is. But it was very, very narrow back then. For women, it would be, ringleted hair, usually blonde, occasionally like a glossy chestnut or brown. Again, with the blue eyes, very porcelain skin, and like a little rosebud mouth. So if you didn't fall into these very, very strict ideas of what beauty was, then you weren't considered beautiful. It's not necessarily that you were considered ugly, but they didn't consider you beautiful. Okay? And so he tries to get her to talk, and she's like, what do you want me to talk about? Because he's like, basically, it's almost like he's saying, entertain me. And she's like, I don't know what you want to talk about. And so she kind of gets him talking instead, and he says, please excuse me for being a little too demanding and masterly, that's just my manner, I'm not used to observing all the niceties. And she says, well, I do forgive you, but not for that, but because you forgot that I'm your, employee. He can tell her to, talk or whatever he wants to do because he's paying her. And he's like, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot about that. And she says, I am sure I should never mistake informality for insolence. One I rather like, the other nothing freeborn would submit to, even for a salary. And he says, humbug, most things freeborn will submit to anything for a salary. Therefore keep to yourself and don't venture on generalities of which you are intensely ignorant. So basically he's saying that although she might not be willing to, compromise her principles or whatever for a salary, there are many who would. And again, next chapter he kind of goes into that a little bit more. And so he goes on and starts talking about how he has faults, and he wants to redeem himself, but he's not sure that he can. And he says that he has remorse for things that he's done, but again, he's being very vague. He's not explaining what those things are. And she says he should repent, and he says, no, that's not the cure. Maybe reformation, so, to reform, to make over, but not repentance. And he says, besides, I have a right to get pleasure out of life, and I will get it, whatever the cost. And she's like, well, then you'll just degenerate further. So she's kind of trying to talk to him almost like Helen Burns would, trying to say, like, if you're not feeling good about yourself, then you need to, trust in God and, rely on Him and His principles, and, you'll be able to make yourself over new. And he's sort of just saying, no, that's not the correct manner. And so they go on like that for a while, and finally she's like, well, I'm going to go put Adele to bed, because he's just not really making a whole lot of sense to her. And he says, you're afraid of me because I talk like a sphinx. And she's like, well, your language is enigmatical. In other words, it's like an enigma. She can't figure it out. She says, I am bewildered, but I'm not afraid. And so he, again, she says, well, I need to go put Adele to bed. And he's like, no, she's already gone out to put on her dress. And we've got more French there because he's talking about what she'll say when she runs in. Let's see. He says, I have my own reasons for thinking her a curious study, reasons that I may, nay, I shall impart to you someday. She pulled out of her box about 10 minutes ago a little pink silk frock, so that's a dress. Rapture lit her face as she unfolded it. Coquetry, which means flirting, runs in her blood, blends with her brains, and seasons the marrow of her bones. And then there's French in there. So what she says is, I must try it on at this very instant. And so she went out of the room and went up to Sophie, her nanny, to help her get dressed. And he says, I know she's going to re-enter soon, and I'll see a miniature of Celine Barons. And we don't know who that is in this chapter, but of course we find out in the next chapter that is Adeles' mom, and she was a French opera singer. So Adele comes running back in, and she speaks in French again, so it's going to translate that to you. She says, is my dress right, and my shoes, and my stockings? Wait, I think I'm going to dance. So she's just so excited about her stuff. And then she says, thank you very much, sir, for your kindness. Mommy used to do it just like that, didn't she? And he says, precisely like that. So she obviously does resemble her mother a good bit. And so then that's the end of that chapter. So even though it is a very confusing chapter and he's being vague through a lot of it, it does reveal us a little bit about Rochester's nature. We learn that there are things he regrets that he's done in his life, although he doesn't elaborate what that is. We learn that he wants to be happy, and he enjoys talking with Jane and wants to kind of have not so much the like employer-employee relationship, but to have somebody to really talk to and to unburden himself to. And he mentions that she's the type who, something about her just makes you want to open up to her. You know, you feel like you can trust her or whatever. She's a good listener. And so we do learn a little bit about that. He talks about a misfortune in his life that turned him bitter. And so really at this point, you're just predicting, you know, like using some inference or some prediction. What do you think he might be referring to? Of course, I'm not going to tell you because we don't know yet. We'll find out as we read later. But keep this part in mind, that there is something in his life that he feels was a misfortune that turned him bitter. And we'll find out what he means later in the book. So chapter 15 opens up, and Jane and Rochester are walking in the garden, and he decides to tell her more about Adeles' parentage. So he goes into a whole basically background story on his relationship with Celine Barons, who was a French opera dancer that he had an affair with in France. So, you know, that's, of course, was not acceptable, but for men in that time period in the Victorian age to keep a mistress was not unheard of. And it very often, for whatever reason, was dancers or people of the opera or whatever. People involved in the theater were considered sort of more fallen or whatever. We've talked about that before, like during Shakespeare's time. It wasn't considered exactly a noble pursuit. And so he was having a relationship with her, and she was a kept woman. He paid for her an apartment, he paid for her clothes, he paid for her to have a carriage. You know, he was a sugar daddy, basically, I guess would be today's terminology for that. And so he talks about how they were in Paris, and he had gone one night to see her, and she wasn't there. So he went on up into her apartment. I mean, he's paying for it. And decided to sit out on the little balcony. And so you may not have seen this in Paris, but you've probably seen some pictures of like the balconies in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And so that's what they're designed after, is Paris. So there would be all these little wrought iron small balconies, not real big, but kind of small enough where you could have like 2 chairs and a little bistro table outside or whatever. So he's sitting out there on this balcony having a cigar and eating some chocolates, and he sees the carriage pull up. And so he's like, oh, okay, that's her. And so he's going to like lean over the balcony and murmur, my angel, which is what that mon ange means. But before he can speak, he sees someone, a man, get out of the carriage after her. And he's like, So he tells Jane, you've probably never felt jealousy, but he felt extremely jealous. And so he pulls back in and, decides to sort of hide out there. And then before he kind of breaks off with his story and starts talking about how he enjoys the day, and he even likes Thornfield, even though there's a lot to make him not like it. And he says he almost felt like there was a hag or a witch from Macbeth saying, you like Thornfield, like it if you can. And he says, I will like it, I dare like it. So he kind of breaks into the middle of the story to to ruminate about Thornfield. And we know that he doesn't really super enjoy Thornfield because Miss Fairfax told Jane that he rarely stays there more than 2 weeks at a time. So obviously there's something, going on that makes him not enjoy staying at his family home. But anyway, he goes back into his story after a while, and so he says that he decided to prepare an ambush. So he pulls the door almost shut, and it's like those French doors that go out onto the balcony, you know what I mean? The two doors that open up. So he pulls it like almost shut and closes the curtains so that he's still sitting outside on the balcony, but he can hear what's going on in the bedroom, okay? And so then Celine Varens and this guy that she's with come in, and he is, sort of listening at the window, and basically they're talking just very frivolous, and they see a card of his on the table, and so they start talking about how ugly he is and how he's, so awful, and Celine's making fun of him, and he says it really made him mad because Celine had always told him that he was a masculine beauty. She always told him how handsome he was and how gorgeous he was. But now here she is talking to this other guy that she's apparently having a relationship with and talking about how ugly he is. So this is why he didn't get mad when he asked Jane, do you think me handsome? And she said no, because he knew she was being honest. He's had people flatter him before. And that's what Celine had done. And then turned out that's not what she believed at all. So he was actually intrigued by Jane being 100% honest with him, because Celine was exactly the opposite. So after listening to all of this for a little while out on that balcony that day that he discovered Celine was cheating on him, it's such a boss move. He just comes in through the window, walks in on them. You can imagine their surprise. They've been sitting there talking about him, and Celine's supposed to be, in a relationship with him, and here she is cheating on him with this other guy. And he gives her notice to vacate the hotel. So basically says, get out. I'm not paying for you to have this hotel anymore. Drops a bag, like a little purse, like a little, bag of money there, and says, kind of like as a parting gift, that's all I'm leaving you with. Good luck. Drops that little bag of money and schedules an appointment with the Viscount for a meeting the next day. Basically, he challenged him to a duel. So that's why he said the next morning he had the pleasure of encountering him and left him a bullet in one of his arms. Feeble as the wing of a chicken. So he challenged that guy to a duel. And basically most duels back then were not to the death. They were to first blood. And so he shoots him in the arm, and therefore he wins the duel. So Celine, he said, when he was saying all this and walking, just breezily walking out, just get out, here's some money, I'm challenging you to a duel, and then he just leaves. So Celine was having hysterics and crying and begging and all that, but he didn't listen to any of that. So that would have been the end of anything to do with Celine, but 6 months before, she had Adele and had told him that Adele was his. So at the time he believed it, but after finding out she's been cheating on him and all that, he no longer believes that Adele is his daughter. And he says after looking at her now as she's older, he is always trying to look to see if she looks like him or any of his family, and she just doesn't. She just doesn't resemble him at all. He says Pilot looks more like him than she does. And so he says that nevertheless when Celine left, and I wanted to make sure you picked up on this too, because remember when Jane and Miss Fairfax at the beginning asked Adele where her mom was, she said she's gone to the Holy Virgin. So Adele obviously thinks her mother is dead, but Rochester says some years after I had broken with her, she abandoned her child and ran away to Italy with a musician or a singer. So she's not dead. She just left. She just left Adele. And so he found out about that. And even though he does not think Adele is his, he felt sorry for the child. I mean, that her mother just ran off with a man and left her with, just left her with some friends or something. So he decided to go and get her and bring her to England and put her at his family home and basically make her his ward, which I told you the other day is not like an official adoption, but somebody he's going to take care of. And he kind of felt like maybe that would make up for some of the bad things he's done in his life if he can, give this poor little orphan child or abandoned child a good home. And so he says, but now that I've told you all that, you're probably going to tell me you don't want to be her governess anymore and you want to leave or whatever, which would be completely appropriate for that time period. Because in the Victorian age, everything was about appearances and what was right and what was proper. And so nobody, most people would not want to be a governess for, basically the child of, a loose woman is what they would have called it, like loose morals. And, but Jane says, no, I love her even more. Like, why would I want to go and, be a governess for some spoiled children who would hate me whenever this child is I feel something in common with her? Because remember, Jane's an orphan too. And she's like, she just wants somebody to love her. And so she spends even extra time with Adele that night. And I thought that was very sweet. So then, later that night, well, before we get to that part, she says, and was Mr. Rochester now ugly in my eyes? No, reader. Gratitude and many associations, all pleasurable and genial, made his face the object I best liked to see. His presence in a room was more cheering than the brightest fire. Yet I had not forgotten his faults. Indeed, I could not, for he brought them frequently before me. He was proud, sardonic, harsh to inferiority of every description. In my secret soul I knew that his great kindness to me was balanced by unjust severity to many others. He was moody, too, unaccountably so. I more than once, when sent for to read to him, found him sitting in his library alone with his head bent on his folded arms. So she realizes that he is sort of deeply troubled. He's kind of that Byronic hero, something deeply troubled. There's something in his past that worries him and bothers him, and he's sometimes gruff and distant. But he's very kind to her, and he's just so interesting. She's drawn to him. And again, this is not a surprise to us at all. Jane is always drawn to things that are sort of more dark or gothic, and so that we're not surprised. So that night, she had tried to fall asleep, and all of a sudden she woke up in the middle of the night. She's asleep, and she hears like a vague murmur up above her. So on the third floor, she seems like she's hearing somebody talking or murmuring, and she's not really sure. And so she sits up in bed listening, and then the clock down the hall, so that would be like a one of those big grandfather clocks, strikes 2 o'clock in the morning, and just then it seems like somebody touches her chamber door, just kind of like brushes past her chamber door, like fingers touching it. You can imagine how scary that would be at 2 in the morning. And so she's super scared, but then all of a sudden she thinks, well, wait, maybe it's Pilot, brushing past the door. Because if they forget to lock Pilot in the kitchen, he'll often go up and sleep right outside Mr. Rochester's room. So she's like, maybe that was just Pilot. But before she could go back to sleep and try to calm herself down, she heard this demonic laugh, low and suppressed and deep. And it sounded like it was at the very keyhole of her chamber door. She said her bed, the head of her bed was near the door, which I could never do. I could never do that. I don't know why her bedroom's set up that way. But the head of the bed is right there next to the door. And so it sounds like the laugh is practically right there in the room with her. And she's terrified. So she gets up and fastens the bolt of her door, so locks the door, and then says, "Who's there?" And she hears out in the hallway something gurgling and moaning, it sounds like. And she's listening. But you know how you ever wake up in the middle of the night and get scared? And you know how if you're listening really hard, you're like, wait, did I hear that or did I imagine that? So I think that's kind of where she is in that. But eventually she hears steps that sound like they're retreating up the gallery towards the staircase. And she hears a door open and close, and then everything was still. And she's like, what on earth was that Grace Poole? Like, is this lady possessed by the devil? Like, what is going on in this household? So she's too scared to go back to sleep, and she's like, I'm just going to have to go to Miss Fairfax. You know, if you get real scared, you kind of just want to talk to a human being. So she's going to go to Miss Fairfax's room, but when she gets out in the hallway, she suddenly realizes that there's smoke, and she turns around and looks and smells something burning, and she realizes that the door to Mr. Rochester's room is partially open, and smoke is like pouring out. And so she goes running in there, and Mr. Rochester is asleep, and the curtains of his bed are on fire. So make sure you understand that it's not the curtains on the window. This is one of those old-fashioned 4-poster beds where you actually have curtains that go all the way around it that you can close. And those curtains are on fire, the curtains of his bed. So she freaks out. Not really, though, because she does the right thing. She goes to the basin, which would be like a big bowl that's near there, and dumps that on it, and every bit of water she can find in the room. Goes back to her own room and brings her own stuff, and she gets the flames put out. Mr. Rochester was senseless, and that so often is how people die in fires, because the smoke, if they don't wake up, the oxygen level gets to the point where they basically pass out, and die of asphyxiation before the flames ever get to them. And so apparently that's what had happened to him. So she finally gets him awake, and he realizes he's lying in a pool of water, and he's like, was there a flood? What's going on? Are you trying to drown me? And she says, no, I'll go get you a candle. Get up. You got to find out what's happening. And he's like, at your peril, you fetch a candle. Wait 2 minutes till I get into some dry garments. So basically, she's got to let him get dressed first. And so he sends her to go get a candle out of her room, and she comes back in, and he looks all around, He looks all around and is like, what happened? And so she tells him everything that had gone through, and she's like, do you want me to get Miss Fairfax or John or Leah? And he's like, no, none of them can do anything. So he tells her to sit right there, that he's got to go check on something, and he takes the candle. So she's sitting there in the dark in a chair in his room with her feet up because the floor is soaked and freezing. And so finally she's like, is he ever going to come back? And he finally comes back in, and he questions her again and is like, you didn't see anything? And she said, no, I just saw a candlestick on the ground. And he said, but you said you heard an odd laugh. You've heard it before? And she said, yeah, it's Grace Poole. He's like, that's right. That's what it is. It's Grace Poole. You guessed it. He says, well, we're the only ones who know about it, so please don't say anything, and I'll handle it. I'll take care of all of it. And so she starts to leave, and then he's like, what? Are you quitting me already and in that way? So you're leaving so quickly? And she's like, but you told me I could go. And he said, yeah, but not without, some word of, goodness, you just saved me from death. At least shake hands. And so he takes her hand in both of his own and says, you have saved my life. I have a pleasure in owing you so immense a debt. I cannot say more. Nothing else that has being would have been tolerable to me in the character of creditor for such an obligation. But you, it is different. I feel your benefits no burden, Jane. So basically he's saying, you saved my life, and my life is in your debt. And if that was anybody else, I would hate it, but I don't mind my life being in your debt, is basically what he says. And so she tries to say goodnight again and leave, but he holds her and says, he holds her hand and says, I knew you would do me good in some way at some time. I saw it in your eyes when I first beheld you. Their expression and smile did not, again he stopped, he proceeded hastily, strike delight to my very inmost heart so for nothing. People talk of natural sympathies. I have heard of good genii. There are grains of truth. My cherished preserver, good night. So basically, that's kind of important because he admits that, her expression in her eyes and her smile strikes delight to his very inmost heart. So he basically admits he has feelings for her and that he knew somehow she would do him good. And here she's just saved his life. Okay? And so she says she thinks she hears Miss Fairfax moving, and so he goes. He says, go, then, go. And she runs back to her room, but she can hardly sleep that night. Okay? This is telling me that I've only got 40 seconds left. Goodness. Okay, well, we talked about that. We definitely went over that one. And I definitely went over that question. This is the part about how she heard the weird laugh, the demonic laugh, and then went outside and found out that Mr. Rochester's room was on fire. And then that's at the very end where he admits that he has feelings for her. Okay? All right, that one was a little bit longer, but a lot happened. Y'all stay well.